established this center in 2009, as Francesco mentioned, we were a group of academics who were very unhappy about the way Palestine was framed, not only in the media, in politics, in culture, whether high culture, popular culture, but we were also very annoyed by the way that Palestine was framed in the academia. And one of our plan was to create a space where young scholars could examine the framing, deconstruct it, offer maybe an alternative framing, so that their academic work, especially as postgraduates, but also as undergraduates, will not be just for the sake of academic career per se, but also for the sake of making something more meaningful of their academic work that would contribute to a moral issue, to a struggle against injustice and for freedom, where you don't give up on your professionalism, but at the same time, you don't give up on your commitment to moral values and ideas. So I like, the name was offered by Francesco and Charlotte, and I find it very, as I said, appropriate term to describe what we have been doing almost more than 12 years and hope to continue. But I'll come back to the center at the end of this presentation. Framing is usually the outcome of what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. A dissonance occurs when certain cognition about reality does not fit the reality we experience. The cognition is based on what we believed in, were taught about, educated about, we think we know about. It is a perception of a reality that inspires us religiously, politically, personally, or maybe we are adopting a certain interpretation of reality because of mundane reasons such as promised dividends or benefits. And then in a particular moment, this cognition of ours, our interpretation of the reality, our perception of the reality, runs into trouble because a mismatch occurs between our perceptions and the reality we encounter. In such a case, we can either change the perception or change the reality to fit the perception. Changing the reality requires certain efforts on our part. We may need to distort the reality. We may need to rely on a certain mythology, religious imperatives, logical explanations to justify why we still stick to a certain cognition, even if the reality itself does not seem to fit that cognition. We need to build a narrative that will sustain the perception of the reality so that we can overcome the cognitive dissonance that occurs. When colonial and imperial powers were motivated to conquer and exploit part of the world, they did not only use power to fit their cognition, namely their right to occupy and colonize, to the reality. They did not only use power to achieve it, they also built a whole set of explanations, justifications, drawing from both religion and secular moral philosophy to produce a narrative, to concoct a narrative that justified colonization and the evils associated with it. In some ways, the justification is what Edward Said used to call Orientalism in his famous and seminal work. In the case that he was interested in the case of the, if you want, the cognitive dissonance of the region he was interested, which was what he called the East, and mainly the Middle East, a misrepresentation of the reality of the Middle East and of the people living in it was produced and was carried out in order to justify the colonization, the occupation of the area, and sometimes the removal and the subjection of the people living in it. The framing of the Middle East in a certain way, through a particular narrative of justification, required powerful institutions behind it. Framing, reframing, misframing are not potent transformers of reality by themselves if there are no powerful institutions and systems behind them. Framing also needs to be sustained because time does not freeze the reality that has been framed. It keeps changing and keeps challenging the framing. The reality keeps challenging and changing in a way that reproduces the cognitive dissonance. It also has it has two in particular to be sustained when a certain framing of reality results in human loss, symbolic or real violence, dispossession or occupation. Whether it deprives someone economically, socially, culturally, or politically, there might be resistance to that oppression, but there might be also resistance to the framing that enabled the oppression. So I could be fighting British imperialism in Egypt because Egypt was occupied in 1882 by Britain, but I would also struggle as an Egyptian thinker in the late 19th century and early 20th century in challenging the justification that Britain used to occupy my homeland. In fact, if I may borrow from Said again, sometimes challenging the framing is all you can do if the balance of power is such that you don't have the power to challenge the reality, but you have the power to narrate a different story about that reality and therefore challenging the framing that the occupier, the colonizer, has built in order to justify the takeover of your homeland. What helps to maintain framing? In our times, it could be academic work, media, educational system, movies, and recently, of course, fake news in the internet. You're either manipulated or misled or intimidated or coerced into accepting a framing that powers want you to accept if you are a direct or indirect victim of this framing, or if you have the potential to challenge the framing. So there are two layers of framing. The origins of the framing, when we might find out what were the motivation behind the framing and a different framing from the reality itself. And a second layer, the survival, if you want, of the framing, where we might find out what sustains the framing and ask how does it withstand the challenges to it, and what are the human price for the failure or the success of challenging or being defeated by a certain framing of a reality that we believe could be a source for violence, inhumanity, and oppression. And this brings me to Palestine, because Palestine is framed, misframed in a way that has the human price of human loss, violence, inhumanity, and oppression, and therefore both examination are essential for anyone who wants to understand what goes on in Palestine and wants to help to change what goes on in Palestine, understanding the origin of the framing, the justified colonization, oppression, and understanding what sustained this framing despite the development on the ground or in the reality. At a certain moment in the 19th century, Palestine was framed as something it was not. It was framed as Jewish when it was Arab. It was framed as part of the future realm of Western civilization when it was part of the Ottoman and Muslim world. And it was framed as a place of redemption for both Christians and Jews, whereas in reality, it was a normal place where people were not looking for redemption, but for evolutional improvement of their lot in life. Well, like so many other parts in the world at that particular time in the mid-19th century, they began their own framing of their environment in terms of ethnicity and not just religion, and later on in terms of nationalism of a sort, which was far more pan-Arab in nature than it is today. So two discrete motivations led Christians and Jews who were not living in Palestine to frame Palestine in a certain way that would affect the fate of the people living there. This happened in particular in the second half of the 19th century. The way they framed Palestine is still relevant today, and its steadfastness, its survival, prevents challenging a reality in historical Palestine of settler colonialism, apartheid, and occupation, and replacing it with democracy, equality, and freedom. One motivation was an evangelical religious imperative. If you were of a certain Christian persuasion, especially in Britain, in the United States, and in Germany, you believed that your faith behooves you to encourage the removal of the Jews in your Western society and persuade them to return, in inverted commas, to Palestine in order to precipitate the second coming of the Messiah, the resurrection of the dead, and secure your ideal place at the end of times. Other members of the Western Christian society cared little about redemption when they began to frame Palestine as a lost Western homeland. They watched the alien Ottoman Empire and wished to take over the spoils. And although in strategic terms, Palestine was not such a valuable asset, it was on the crossroad to valuable avenues to the east. And in the imperial scramble for achievements, taking over a territory so that another power would not have it was a good enough reason to find the framing that would justify it. It was particularly in Britain that evangelical framing of Palestine as a place of Christian redemption fitted well an expansionist imperial school of thought of making Palestine not just Jewish on the way of becoming Christian, which was this idea of the resurrection of the dead and eventually the conversion of the Jews to Christianity, and if they refused, they would be shish kebab in hell. It was not only this framing of Palestine as the New Jerusalem, if you want, but it was also the wish to frame Palestine as part of the British Empire. So it was a craving for a Christian Palestine, but also for a British Palestine. The manifestation of this framing can be found in hundreds of travelogues that were written about Palestine by Europeans who came over and visited the place. You can find it in the speeches of politicians, in the sermons of clergymen. Eventually, at a given moment, and it took up to 1915, in 1915 it became the idea of framing Palestine as Jewish on the way to becoming Christian and as part of the British Empire. This kind of framing became official policy of the British Empire in 1915, towards the end of the first year of the First World War. Palestine had to be both British and Jewish, or rather we should say Zionist, as part of the objectives of the war of Britain in the Middle East. The framing was adopted by the most powerful actor in the international arena at the time, the British Empire, and the indigenous population of Palestine had no chance in the world when they warned already then, or some of them warned already then, that such a framing would lead to their disaster. The Christian and British perception influenced also the new Jewish perception of Palestine, or the new Jewish framing of Palestine. And in fact, the Christian framing preceded the Jewish framing in many ways. In the Jewish older framing of reality, Palestine was until the mid-19th century a place of pilgrimage for the few, but not a redemption for the many. Territory and nation were alien concepts for most of the Jews, even when they were targeted and victimized by anti-Semitism. But framing first Judaism as nationalism and then Palestine as the national homeland for the Jews was one way of coping with anti-Semitism and a sense in the minds of a minority of Jews that neither assimilation nor international ideologies, such as liberalism or socialism, will be the panacea for the hatred towards Jews. So what better than an old homeland, redeemed with the help of Britain, and the creation of a new Jew free of anti-Semitism and much more respected, so they hoped, among the other nations of Western civilization. This was not unique to the Zionist movement. Such a framing was typical for settler colonial movements all around the world at the same period and a little bit before even. Movements that coveted a new home, seeking refuge from Europe where they were persecuted, a movement of people, that coveted a new home, who sought refuge from Europe where they were persecuted for whatever reason. And they were looking for a new home that would be best a homeland if it were to remain part of Europe. If you want a home away from home that doesn't want you. The cognitive dissonance is that, and you understand it, I'm sure all, was that the new home or the new homeland was inhabited by another people. You could just remove these people, genocide them, displace them, and replace them. But you are part of the West, so you don't use power for the sheer usage of power. You justify the employment of power, even the most brutal power of genociding, ethnic cleansing indigenous population. In the case of Palestine, it helps if you, the settler, mix mythology with hard facts and produce a narrative that justifies the new reality you created, namely taking over by force a homeland that belonged to someone else. It is a precarious narrative, and hence you can never allow yourself to stop the actual physical oppression and dispossession. But you're also relying on the story that justify these actions. So here it is how it worked in the case of Zionism in Palestine. First of all, the Zionist settlers claimed that the land was empty and that there were the people of the land. Most of them were imagining this empty land or this emptiness before they arrived actually in Palestine itself. And when it turned out that the land was not empty, they changed the narrative. They said, yes, the land is not empty, but it is inhabited by nomads, people with no roots. But then it seems that these rootless nomads refused to be removed, transferred, or accept their own framing as aliens in their homeland, which was a basic element in the Zionist narrative of the time with regard to the Palestinians. Now, this was realized in the 1920s by Zionist leaders and activists that framing the Palestinians as nomads or claiming that basically the land was empty for 2,000 years is not going to dissuade the Palestinians from struggling against the Zionist colonization, and might even not be enough to persuade people around the world not to support the Palestinian cause of liberation. So the settler movement built military force and produced a narrative that justified forceful removal of the native population. Framing-wise, a massive ethnic cleansing, which the Zionist movement perpetrated in 1948, is not an easy fact to defend in the post-1945 world. So first, the official state of Israel and its historians denied the fact that there was ethnic cleansing. In fact, until today, official Israel claims that there was no ethnic cleansing. They even went as far, and they still do today, in suggesting a voluntary self-expulsion. With time, this kind of argument does not hold water. So the state and its academics cast the blame on the refugees for bringing this upon themselves. The famous quote of Golda Meir rings in my ears when I'm saying this. We will never forget the Palestinians, what they forced us to do to them. And when this sounded less convincing to a more knowledgeable audience during the 1980s, which was slowly exposed to the counter-narrative, the Israeli tendency was to use historical comparison to say, you know, it happened elsewhere. This is how modern nations were born, which is true, but does not solve the cognitive dissonance between the framing and the reality of oppression. And the reason is because of the human cost and its ongoing nature of the oppression. You may have built a perfect narrative and framing, but the colonized people still fight for liberation. So there's something wrong with the framing. And you have been unable to ethnically cleanse all of them, although you have taken over all of their homeland. The liberation struggle on the one hand, and the crumbling and debunking of the most absurd arguments you have built over the years to deal with the cognitive dissonance, endanger the sustainability of the framing. The story, I'll give a few examples of the most absurd elements in this framing, such as the story, I used to live here 2,000 years ago, therefore it is mine. This is not working anymore. Or as a settler, I brought modernization to the people of Palestine, whom, by the way, I claim did not exist. This is not challenged only in Palestine, but in the 1980s and until today, this idea of the burden of the white man is challenged all over the decolonized world. And all the absurd oxymorons seem to crumble in the late 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. It's impossible to sell anymore the idea of a Jewish and democratic state, an enlightened occupation, or the purity of arms. Nobody seems to take them seriously anymore. But you're still, as a state, Israel still is powerful enough to intimidate or bribe the powers that they feel are necessary to be behind them in order to maintain the reality of apartheid, settler colonialism, and oppression. And the framing is still something you fight for as an Israeli Jew. You try to suppress any academic work that challenge the framing, as we have seen just recently, both in the University of Bristol and in the University of Glasgow. Any educational program that refuses to abide by this framing, you are attacking it, you are challenging it, and you will destroy also any politician who is not loyal to this framing. Because deep down, whether you are a statesman, a politician, or an Israeli academic, you know that if the framing would have no power base, no reference group, it would be totally exposed for what it is, sheer propaganda, shielding and providing immunity for colonization and oppression, you might find yourself in the society or in the company of rogue states that are tolerated for economic and strategic interests by political elites in the West, but detested by the societies, and you fear this might not be enough in the future. Domestically, inside Israel, Israel is still doing well. De-Arabization of the Arab Jews is still working. Pinkwashing still works. But it seems that it's difficult to maintain the charade of democracy, which still caters for large sections of the Israeli electorate. But Israel is losing what probably many of its leaders would consider part of the human capital that Israel possesses, which is drained and moving, of all places, to Berlin, among other destinations for a new life as ex-Israelis. There is an attempt to resurrect the liberal Zionist version, the kind of shooting and crying version, kind of a version that seems to be more comfortable to sell as framing of the reality to the world, which includes condemning the 1967 settlers, expressing admiration for the Palestinian Authority, but demonizing everyone else, and attacking, if you are a liberal Zionist, even if you are reading and writing in Haaretz, anyone who dares to raise the possibility that the Zionist framing of the past, present, and future realities in historical Palestine is the main cause for the violence, the dead, the wounded, the refugees, and the traumatized children of Palestine. The framing inside Israel cannot be exported. You can tell Arab Jews in Israel that they are not Arabs. You can tell Palestinians in Israel that they are not Palestinians. And you can deem every Palestinian baby as a potential terrorist and every Palestinian village as a potential enemy base. And you can tell yourself that Gaza is not a city, but a fortified bunker of terrorists. And this is, and you can still believe that it's totally democratic not to allow Palestinian citizens of Israel to live in certain towns and places, and to employ, and not to be employed in certain jobs, and not to allow them to buy land, or tell Palestinians that they can only drive on certain roads, and to imprison them without trial, and demolish their houses by a military decree, and most of and other things of that sort. But it is difficult to sell nowadays the framing that seems in the eyes of the Israelis to justify these apartheid, brutal, callous actions against the Palestinians. So what do? You know what they do. They weaponize anti-Semitism against anyone who finds these framing immoral or dangerous. They recruit the Holocaust memory to suppress such criticism. And erroneously, I think they believe that this will work in the long run, but they do not. So let me finish by saying, where is the role of the European Center for Palestine Studies in this struggle against the framing of Palestine by the Zionist movement before 1948 and by the State of Israel and its supporters since 1948? What we do in Exeter, we examine as academics the framing, we examine the reality, we examine the interrelations between the framing and the reality. We examine the consequences of the mismatch between the Zionist and Israeli framing and the reality on the ground. We evaluate the human cost of such a framing, and we suggest ways forward. We do not claim that what happens in Palestine is exceptional, and therefore we are part of a network that does not allow framing anywhere in the world to discriminate, to kill, to destroy, to remain unchallenged and without offering alternative. Whether it is a framing that justifies the victimization of African Americans, Native Americans, Black British citizens and subjects, Muslim minorities, women, or anyone else, that their misframing or they misframed location in a certain narrative justifies over the years and justifies the brutal policies and attitudes by other human beings who treat them in the world of Paul Gilroy as infrahumans. So when you write a BA dissertation, an MA dissertation, a doctoral dissertation within the program, the MA program and PhD program for Palestine Studies in the University of Exeter, you have our protection to be bold enough to challenge this framing, to offer a different framing, to do it professionally, but without losing your moral compass when you do this. Not many places in the academic world offer you something which is not just satisfying your appetite for knowledge, but also offer you a way to meaningful life and life with a meaning through that particular stage that you will pass for short or longer times in the academia. So I will stop here. And again, thank you so much, Francesco and Charlotte, for giving me the opportunity to share with you these ideas and tell you what I think about the center. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ilan. Thank you for this opportunity to hear you. I think it was very dense, deep, and it gave us a lot of food for thought. We already have two questions, and I will start from these. The first one is from Khulud that asks, I would like to know more about any archives that have been made so far about the right of land, I imagine the right to the land, in opposition to the Zionist narrative, because she's working on that for her master thesis.
Okay, thank you, Khulud. It's difficult to know for the question of what period you ask, but I will give a general picture, and I hope this will also satisfy. And of course, we can talk afterwards individually. So I would be more specific on the period that we are talking about. I think to begin with, and this also is part of the story of framing, and it's very interesting that you bring it up. There was a certain way of understanding what land ownership meant in Palestine before the arrival of the British, or before the beginning of the British Mandate. There was a certain Ottoman way of understanding land ownership and attachment to the land, even if you were a tenant working and living for centuries on a land that might have been owned by a landowner who was absent owner, who was not living in Palestine. Since the mid-19th century, according to the reforms in the land law in the Ottoman Empire, were becoming not just people who leased the land from the Sultan, but became proper, if you want, landowners. But nonetheless, there was a certain unwritten contract between the landowner and the tenants, the responsibility of the landowners to the tenants, and a sense of attachment and ownership by the villagers themselves, which for years succeeded to retain them as the actual cultivator and benefactors from the land that they were living on. What the British did with, and were prodded to do this by the Zionist movement, was to bring the idea of personal land ownership from Britain into Palestine, and to claim that actually a simple transaction between the old landowner and a new landowner, which might have happened in Beirut, gives the new landowner, i.e. the Zionist movement, total authority and permission to get rid of the tenants, even if we are talking about the whole village that existed for 1,000 years. The Ottomans would have never allowed such an act to happen. The British believed that they were introducing a more advanced, progressive way of ownership. And in fact, what they did, they knowingly or unknowingly, we're still arguing about this, helped the Zionist movement to already ethnically cleanse quite a large number of Palestinians already in the 1920s. So I still think it's not so much of finding an archives that shows a different land ownership when you are challenging the academic, even Zionist framing of the land question in Palestine. It's reinterpreting the land ownership. That's, I think, I don't think you'll find a lot of new documents, but what you can do is very important, is to reinterpret these documents in a way that explains how supposedly an advanced European way of thinking of land ownership was used in order to already ethnic cleansing the Palestinians even before 1948. I'm thinking about Wadi Hawaris in 1926, of Marj ibn Ammar in the north in 1925, where the British, Palestinians with the help of lawyers such as Auni Abdel Hadi would go to the court, and in the court would sit a British judge and would say, well, but these are the new owners and they have the right, to evict. And he ordered the police to go there and evict them. And the whole context of settler colonialism, the whole context of dispossession, the whole context of the Zionist ideology of transfer and ethnic cleansing, of course, was not considered at all to be a factor in these debates about land ownership. So I think land ownership is very, very important, and it doesn't end. I mean, one of the things the late Patrick Wolf taught us, that settler colonialism is a structure and not an event. Israel is using the same tactics in the West Bank. There's nothing new. Funny enough, it's not even funny, it's absurd. Now they're using Ottoman laws in order to justify not allowing people in Yatta and Masafir Yatta in the south of Hebron, south of Halil, to cultivate their land. The settler colonial power would use either the Ottoman law, the British law, and its own laws according to the target, not according to which law is better. They would use the law that would enable them most efficiently to continue the ethnic cleansing that they have not completed in 1948. So I think it's a very important topic. And again, I think very few places would allow such what needs to be done, which is rethinking the framing. So it's not just about documents and so on, but of course the kushans that people still have in Palestine, This is exactly what I mean. That's a documentation of the system that created an organic society living in solidarity with one another and in a way that did not endanger their presence on the land. They had a lot of problems with the Ottomans, but one of them was not that the whole village would be expelled. And I think this is where a lot of work can be done.
Thank you.
Also, Khulud, if you feel like you want to, as Professor Ilan was saying, if you want to ask something more specific, if you had something more specific, I mean, as a time frame and so on, I mean, just.
Okay, first I would be honored to speak to Ilan Pape because I have read a lot of his books during my master's studies. I'm doing it in Sweden and I'm from Lebanon. I'm really concerned about the Palestinian issue. And with the archiving, I mean that we need to do some kind of narrative against the Zionist narrative in rethinking and reframing the land as it's the ownership of Palestinians since the very beginning. Because I have read in the book Ethnic Cleansing of Palestinians, something about the calligraphy that they have done, this department that they have worked on to re-establish the villages of Palestine based on Hebrew features. For this reason, I thought that we could do something like this and we just like oppose the initial narrative, what I mean.
Yes, thank you, Khulud. I think most of the people who listen maybe know what you're talking about. Just to explain that Khulud is referring to the way a certain Israeli committee of names was changing the names of the more than 500 destroyed Palestinian villages and gave it new names when they built Jewish settlements on that. And usually they gave them names of what supposedly were their original name during the biblical times, as a kind of erasing the whole history from the time of the Bible to the time of the conquest of the village in 1948. So definitely, this is again, it's ownership in other means, I call it. You don't just get ownership by law. You get ownership by changing names, by destroying the village, by erasing anything that reminds people of the village, and so on. Yes, I think this is a crucial way of challenging the framing by examining how the framing is done and how we can challenge it. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Khulud, so much. And I mean, I feel free to tell you also to just stay in touch. Like you can write to any of us, and I mean, feel free to stay in touch with your research. We'll be happy to help you in any way.
Will do. I'm so honored.
It's a pleasure. And there's also a small comment from Professor Nadia for you in the chat. So if you want to check it, I think it would be beneficial. Going to the other question, we have another one from Jack Rose. He's asking, how far do you think the very recent designation of 6 Palestinian human rights organizations as terrorist groups by the Israeli state contributes to this framing of Palestine, both within Israel, Palestine itself, and the wider field, both academically and otherwise?
Oops. A very good example of framing, which I didn't mention because you can't mention all the chapters of framing in one lecture. But framing the Palestinian liberation movement and framing the Palestinian liberation struggle as a terrorist struggle with a very dogmatic definition of terrorism, namely people who just want to kill other people for the sake of terror. This is inbuilt into the Zionist framing and representation of the Palestinian struggle from very early on, from the mandatory period to our times, and definitely framing a human rights organization as a terrorist organization is just the most blunt example of doing it without even feeling the need to substantiate it. It's just words. Hollow words that have nothing to do with their reality. But this is why I think it's so important not just to struggle, and this is an important struggle, to convince now people who still needs convincing. I think most of the world doesn't need convincing, that these 6 organizations are human rights organizations. Of course, this is important, and it could easily be done because even relatively conservative American human rights organizations are shocked and bewildered by this Israeli action. So I think we are in a different moment in the history of Palestine with regard of such wild and crazy accusation. But it's far more important, I think, to explain the anti-colonialist nature of the Palestinian struggle. And this became difficult in the 2 periods in which anti-colonialism as an armed struggle in the history of Palestine reached a certain peak. One was in the 1970s, in the last century, and one is today, the armed struggle that the Hamas is conducting for the liberation of Palestine. During the time of the 1970s, it was easy, or it was at least an attempt, to frame the Palestinian struggle, because it was secular and it was mainly leftist, as part of the communist plan to take over the world. So they were condemned as rats under the bed in order to delegitimize that particular struggle. Now, they are being delegitimized as being part of the Islamic terror against the West. Nothing to do with Palestine. These are fanatic Muslims who want to impose a fanatic Sharia and kill all the non-Muslims or all the non-believers. So the framing takes different shape in different periods. And one way of challenging it is not to give up on terms that might seem not so relevant anymore, such as colonialism, anti-colonialism, decolonization. They are relevant today as much as they were in the late 19th century. And we are so fortunate at the University of Exeter that we have a network on decolonization that our colleague Katie Netanel has contributed so much to creating. We benefit as academics for this, sustaining the idea of decolonization, not only when we examine the right of the Palestinians to struggle for their freedom and independence and against the Israeli oppression, but also we understand that decolonization is the struggle of Black Britain. It is the struggle of asylum seekers in Britain, of Muslim minorities in the West, of Native Americans, of African Americans, of Native Americans in South America, in Chile, in Brazil, in Mexico, that this is a struggle that understands that physical decolonization of the world is not mental decolonization, is not human decolonization. And not surprising for so many of these movements of liberation, Palestine is still the issue. Palestine still epitomizes not only a justified struggle for decolonization, but the hope that whereas elsewhere in the Arab world and in Africa, decolonization went sour and did not create the coveted new world that everybody was hoping. So Palestine still has the potential to produce something else, not just as part of anti-colonialism, but also part of a decolonized world.
Thank you, Lan, again. So if you have other questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat. There's someone with a hand raised, I see.
Yes, Emil has raised his hand.
Please, you have the floor.
Sorry, I don't have my camera on because my kids took it. Yeah, he wants to do a film on the ocean. We have to save the ocean, so.
Okay. For you. Yes.
Yeah, I know. Thank you. It's fascinating listening to you, Lan, as usual. And I enjoyed a lot what you have said and took lots of notes. I just want to add a small thing. When at the beginning one feels that there's a sharp distinction between, let's say, reality and framing or the realm of discourse, so to speak, and all of that. And that distinction is might be a little bit troublesome when it comes to methodological questions. I'm talking here, taking out of the immediate context. Of course, I agree with everything you said, but that seems to me that we are dealing with not necessarily reality as such, but we're dealing with the subjugated knowledge and suppressed knowledge of the the colonized people here, and we are dealing with the that frame that is basically oppressed and suppressed by the Zionist movement and by the liberal ideology overall, because you find the same logic over, in order to take land, for example, John Locke, like one of the famous liberal theorists, just you need to mix your labor in the land and then becomes yours. So that's how, the justification of how settlers took the land of the natives in America or Canada and elsewhere. And we have the same frameworks to justify that. And in the same thing in Palestine, what we have here is actually the suppression of the native framing of their own existence, a way of living. And that's very, very clear, because it becomes even more obvious when you look at the imagery around Palestine. So if you try to look on a documentary from like the 1930s or 20s, or like during the Mandate period, you can't find actually moving imagery of Palestine. It's really hard to see anything how the place looked like. You find snapshots here and there, and that's just the whole background is basically suppressed. And Palestine is represented in these moving images. And because I taught a little course in there, and it was fascinating, as a place, basically a derelict place and basically a desert, etc. And I was asking one of the students, what was your thought when you looked at in these, especially the Zionist movies? And one of them said, I was surprised, because the answer, why do you want to go to such a derelict place, a desert? And it was really fascinating, because it tells you that, again, like this narrative of, it doesn't work even by these representations. The suppression of the native frame and perception of their own reality is what we are dealing with, rather than the sharp distinction between reality and the realm of discourse and perception. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Emil. Yes, no, I totally agree with you on that layer of explaining what reality is altogether. But I think you may have, just to explain again, when I say that there is a cognitive dissonance between perception and reality, it is what the cognition of the people themselves encounters. Whether they encounter a reality which is objectively the true reality or not is not that relevant for me. In their own mind, if they perceive a land to be empty and they go to the beach on the coast in Jaffa and they see that the people are living in Gaza, there is a clash between the perception or framing of Palestine as an empty land and the people that they meet. And I'm not interested so much in whether they were right or wrong. I'm interested in what do they do when their perception of that reality clashes with what they encounter. So I'm less interested in what they encounter is the objective reality or not, which I don't think exists, and I agree with you on this. But I think it's very important. You will never understand liberal Zionism if you would not understand that they think that their cognition is encountered and challenged by the reality that exists. It's their own trouble of cheating themselves, as they think that they're cheating themselves, but they justify this self-cheating as an act of survival. So I think I totally agree with you, but I think it has to be, because it is subjective and not objective, it is so powerful and so worrying, because it seems that they will always find a way of circling the square or squaring the circle in order to justify the cognition that they have or the framing that they have. And this framing would continue to lead to brutality and violence on the ground. So our chance of at least creating a challenge to their framing is not only based on that was my talk, not just based on the reality, it's based on the contradiction that they themselves understand exist, and what I call the oxymorons and the most absurd part of that. But thank you very much. I think it's an important a layer or dimension to this discussion that has to be definitely interacted with in the future. Definitely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you, Ilan. So we have two last questions, and there's a very, very last one that came at the very moment. So just let us know, Ilan, if you have time for the three of them. Okay.
Yeah. Sure.
Okay, thank you so much. I will read them all together so we can go through them before wrapping up. So one of the questions is, I also have a question relating to a master paper. The discussion of Israeli-Palestinian conflict colonization is often limited to this binary. How do you feel that the inclusion of ethnic religious minority voices, such as the Druze, the Baha'i, could reframe this conflict and process? This is one question. Then we have another one, which is, why are academic researchers in Palestinian and Jewish affairs afraid of being accused of anti-Semitism? What is their academic and practical future if they are accused? And then we have the very last one that is very, very related to this one, which is, thank you very much, Professor Pape, for this very interesting lecture. My question is, to what extent can the framing of Palestine and Israel really be changed? Because human rights organizations, which should be consensus of all of us, regularly report on human rights violation by Israel against Palestinians. All those who deal with the conflict should therefore see the Palestinians as oppressed, but this is not happening. As I come from Germany, I have to add that even on a scientific basis, I can hardly say Palestine without someone shouting anti-Semitism at me. And this is all. Thank you.
Fantastic three questions, definitely. Let me start with the first one. Again, I think it also relates a little bit to what Emil was saying. I don't think there is a binary, an Arab-Jewish binary. The binary, such a binary is the binary or dichotomy that the Zionist framing of reality insists on. The framing of Palestine in Zionist and Israeli narrative is about binary. I create a different binary, and that is not a very rigid one, but it is the one that I think is helpful, much more helpful. And this is the settlers, for example, versus the indigenous, the native population. So the fact that you are part of the indigenous population, or the fact that you are part of the settler population, does not necessarily tell us what is your position towards the reality that evolved as a result of the encounter between a settler movement and an indigenous population. It's possible that as part of the native population, you were seeking collaboration with the settlers. It's possible that you found that actually as a very tiny minority, a new settler regime compared to the old one benefits you. That unfortunately some minorities in the Middle East, out of probably a sense of survival, sometimes collaborated with the colonialist empires in North Africa in particular, but not only there, also in Iraq and Syria, when they thought that the colonial empire can give them some benefits, even equality that maybe was not there before. So I think that the binary is not a binary of identity. It's a binary, if at all it's a binary. It's a juxtaposition of your, almost I would say objective, although I don't like to use the word objective, but a kind of the situation where you find yourself in this encounter between a settler movement and you being indigenous on the one hand, and much more important, your attitude towards that reality that the encounter has produced, and how you interpret this reality. And every reality is a constructed and interpreted reality. So in this respect, The Druze are a very good example, and just 1 minute, and then I'll go to the two other questions very quickly. I'm doing now, one of the many researches I'm doing now is a field work with my good friend Johnny Mansour in the Druze villages of the Galilee, where we were surprised to find out how the Druze villages felt very guilty about the role that Druze played in the Nakba. And they provided asylum and shelter to a lot of Palestinians. And in fact, the fact that there are quite a few Palestinians in the Galilee today has a lot to do with the fact that the Druze sheltered them after the fighting, which was a kind of a guilt complex. I won't go into details, but it showed us that it's not only that the Druze cannot be fixated in one particular position. It's a dynamic attitude. It changes according to your own moral image, your own moral standing, the reality around you, your relationship with the powers that be, and so on. But definitely each community, like each person, should be examined and talked to and understood by their own surroundings rather than generalizing about them. The second question is, why is such a fear from such accusation? And I think it's connected to the third question that comes in particular from Germany. How can you frame if, even if you mention the word Palestine in Germany, you run into trouble? So I think it's connected to one another. The ability of a state, especially a high-tech nation, a state which is part of the OECD, to obtain support for its existence, for its policies from multinational corporations, from governments, from strategic interest, is always there and outside, unfortunately, the moral discussion about justice and liberation. And we are not naive. We know how the world works, not only in the case of Israel, also of other cases. So it's a very good question to ask. If you have two causes, if you want, in historical Palestine, and one cause entirely bases its support in the world on political elites, economic elites, on its own power either to intimidate or to bribe or to offer interests, strategic interests. And the other side, almost without exception, through the moment it encountered the first Zionist settlers, believed that civil society are more important because it's easier to speak to civil society about justice. It's not easy to talk to a minister in the British government about justice. I mean, it's easy to talk to them because they're very talkative and they all went to good universities and they know how to talk, but they don't mean anything when they talk about justice. But when you talk to people in the street in London, they know what justice is, but they don't have any influence on the reality on the ground. But you always hope, and you think you learned from history something, that the fact that the civil society does not accept the framing that allows the oppression, the occupation, maybe one day will influence the policies from above in a way that would influence the reality on the ground. So yes, there is fear because you can lose your job in the university, you can lose your political career, you'll be condemned of being racist and anti-Semite. Not many people want to be in these positions. And therefore, you know, the campaign of fear and intimidation works not only in Germany, by the way, it works also in other places in the West. The way to challenge it is, of course, not to be alone, to be part of a network, not to cave in, not to allow these allegations to stick, to fight against these allegations together, never alone, and to believe that, as happened in the case of apartheid South Africa, civil societies eventually have some impact on policies from above, And when Mandela was described as an arch terrorist, he was eventually received as a great hero 21 years later, since that declaration by Margaret Thatcher. So yes, you're dealing with a campaign of fear and intimidation by a powerful institution, but you're not alone. And it's very important to be part of networking such as the European Center for Palestine Studies, solidarity movement with the Palestinians. I think there is a lot of good energy and commitment there that can withstand most of these assaults and attacks. And I'm not saying this is going to be easy, but it's hugely important, and you will find yourself on the right side of history, which is probably the best reward I can offer you, apart from some coffee and tea if you come to visit us, and some cakes of a mediocre quality, but we're trying to improve. Okay.
Thank you, Lan. Thank you so much. And thank you also to all of our guests and for the very interesting questions. I think it's been a very deep evening, sorry. I'm thinking about time in Jerusalem, so here it's night already. But jokes apart, thank you all really for being here. Thank you for also being here on this very first day of our series. I hope you will stay with us. We're having another event scheduled for the 26th of November, which will be the presentation of a book. And I don't want to give you too many details, just to keep you a little bit curious and willing to engage with us. But of course, I hope that you have seen which is the kind of intellectual engagement that we're trying to give, and this will be the standard for the series. So see you on the 26th, hopefully. I want to thank again Professor Ilan for his time and for his wonderful lecture. Thank you so much. And thank you all. I just wanted to tell you that, I mean, since some of you intervened, our original plan would be to then put on YouTube the record of the event. Of course, if anyone doesn't agree, anyone that appeared, feel very free to write to me, and we find a way to either not having you in the video or not uploading it, of course, because the first thing is privacy, and we know these are very sensitive topics. So let us know. And good night. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesco. Thank you very much. Good night, everyone.
Thank you so much for the valuable session.
Thank you. Thank you very much.